Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Stacy and I'm the CEO of the San Francisco Education Fund. Thank you for joining us today for part two of our two-part series around education equity in San Francisco. There's been so much discussion around the district's budget situation and complexities that we really wanted to bring some experts together to talk through how did we get here, what's been the history and the policies that have influenced our budget situation, and how can we think about moving forward in a way that best serves kids. Before we dive in, some of you might be new to the Ed Fund, so a quick introduction. The San Francisco Education Fund is one of the longest standing nonprofits in San Francisco for over 60 years, serving public school students. Our mission has been clear. It has always been about improving access to quality education for public school students by mobilizing the community. And that means all of you here, and then some, our people, our companies, our businesses, our resources as one of the most innovative cities in the country and world to really support our kids and their futures. Since we've started, we have provided over $8 million in teacher and student grants and tuitions and have placed thousands of volunteers in classrooms all across the city. And even through the pandemic, our team has pivoted and shown up in amazing ways, whether that has been providing technology support in over 20 languages to thousands of families, doing COVID relief funds, virtually tutoring, volunteering. I think there's so much our families have needed over the past year and a half that we are continuing to evolve ourselves to best serve our students. So before I introduce today's topic, I want to do a quick introduction for Rob, our partner here from TogetherSF. We're so excited to have TogetherSF be a co-sponsor of this event. If you're not familiar yet with TogetherSF, they came up during the pandemic to really focus on civic engagement and education in San Francisco. Rob, thanks again for being here. Can you take a minute to introduce yourself and the organization?
Yeah, no, thank you, Stacy, for that. Like you said, I'm Rob from TogetherSF. We're a civic engagement nonprofit here in San Francisco, and our goal is to help San Francisco residents, one, better understand how our city government works, including our school district, as well as finding ways to connect people to opportunities to get involved in their community and build up their network so that they can work together to take action together on the issues that they care about. And of course, like the first step for us in taking action is better understanding the issues and challenges that are facing our city and our school district. And that's why I'm so excited to be a part of, this talk today, being able to help people get informed on the budget, the situation that our school district is currently in, and understanding how complex this really is. So I'm really excited to just be a part of this. Thank you again for inviting us, and I look forward to today's discussion.
Thank you, Rob. So before I introduce our amazing panelists together, I want to just set a little bit of context for the conversation we're having and why we're talking about budget and public school finances. Last time we had our first part of this two-part series, we talked a lot about what's underlying the differences in outcomes in our schools. And for those who may not know, we have some schools where only 8% of our students can read proficiently at grade level. And then other schools where 90% of the students are able to read at grade level. And this is insane when you think about who we are as a city, of how could there be such wide discrepancies in terms of an 8-year-old's reading abilities. They're so young. What is happening here? And we learned fundamentally a lot of it has been because of the historical legacy of having to have segregated schools that then concentrated poverty and race in different communities that then has created a legacy of then the challenges schools are facing in different communities and disproportional impacts of poverty that they're having with certain groups of students. And this was by design back in the day, but to think about the inertia that has resulted from this initial design decades and decades ago. And finally, when we finally desegregated, even though we have tried to shift away from that, there's been so much fundamentals built in this way that when people talk about systemic inequalities, this is really what they're talking about, of it's built in the systems of how public schools have been shaped and formed. On top of that piece of just how policy has created separations between poverty and race in our schools, we're adding on the layer today of the financial inequities and why that is the case, and looking even beyond just San Francisco to talk about what's happening in California and federal policy that has resulted in California shifting from being one of the top funded states to now, one of the lowest funded states in our country, which is, again, crazy to think about when California is the third largest economy in the world. So lots to talk about today about how we got here. What does that then mean about how we move forward? Because, finance is one thing, but when you think about it, and me personally as a parent, I think about it as, I want my child to have great teachers, to go to a classroom where they have all the resources and books and equipment that they might need to teach her. I want them to have a community of support where they can train teachers and have budgets for that. And so when we talk about finance, it's really about talking through, are we resourcing our schools well enough and able to do so well enough that our kids aren't suffering in their quality of education because of the lack of funding and resources? So that's the core of why we're talking about finances today. So this, as a reminder, the session is being recorded, and let me pass this on to introduce our panelists. Irina, can you kick us off with an introduction?
Sure. Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me here. I'm Irina Akhramchuk, and I'm an associate professor of educational administration at San Francisco State University. I also coordinate educational administration programs and cohorts at San Francisco State. Prior to that, I was at Arizona State for 6 years. So I have been in higher ed for now more than 10 years. And before I trained as a policy scholar, I graduated from University of California, Davis, with a degree in school organization and educational policy. And my dissertation work involved looking at the categorical finance and how those funds trickle down to underrepresented students, more specifically English language learners and language minority students or not. And so that's where my interests lie, and my future work, essentially, or current work, stems from those interests to look at how underrepresented, marginalized, often marginalized communities are served or not in our K-12 educational system. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you for being here. Carol, I'm going to pass it to you. Can you share a little bit more about your background and the perspective you're bringing in today?
Well, hi, everyone, and thanks. My name is Carol Kosovar, and I'll give you a short tour of what I've done. First, I've helped create and write for Ed 100, which is a free web resource to help parents and community understand how the education system works. And we do have a lot of lessons on school funding. So after this, if you want more, just go to Ed 100. I'm past president of the California State PTA. I've been a legislative advocate as a volunteer on budget issues and school finance. And I've been involved locally on a number of initiatives that we passed in San Francisco for more funding, which I'll talk about later. And I have 2 kids that graduated successfully from the San Francisco School District.
Fantastic. Proud parent of a public school students, Carol. Thank you for being here with us today. Yes. Before I pass it to Debbie, our third panelist, who will be doing a presentation around just the history and where we are and provide some foundational knowledge about the budget, I wanted to share that Debbie has worked closely with the SFUSD finance team, and unfortunately, as you guys know, it's all hands on deck with school right now, including the finance team, so they couldn't join us today, but did inform some of Debbie's presentation she's going to share. So we're going to go into that. So Debbie, let me pass it to you for a quick introduction, and feel free to share with us what you have presented.
Thanks, Stacy, and hi, everyone. Plus one, like Carol, I am a San Francisco Unified School District parent. I have a high schooler and a middle schooler, and just very encouraged to see all of you here at this panel. There is a lot to talk about when it comes to the SFUSD budget. And just to sort of situate myself and explain how I approach thinking about the SFUSD budget. First, I come as a parent, and I'm very concerned with not only my children's school site budgets, but also their peers across the city. I also am a SF Ed Fund board member, so I have a interest as someone who has been involved in trying to aggregate private sector corporate support and foster connections between our public school system and our stakeholders here in San Francisco. It's a very important partnership, and as I get into the presentation, hopefully I can convey to all of you how important it is to access and activate all of us caring adults to think about what's happening in our schools and how we can robustly and justly support our kids here in San Francisco and hopefully everywhere. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead, start my timer. We have a lot to cover in 10 minutes, so I apologize if I go really fast, but let's just go for it. Let me go ahead and try and share my screen correctly if I can. Is anyone seeing anything? Okay.
Yes, Debbie.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, sorry, okay. All right, so we're here to talk about the budget here in SFUSD, but our first panel talked about segregation in schools, and so much of our budget is related to the historical context of how we fund public schools here in California. So just to zoom way back in history and zoom broadly back, I wanted to focus our attention on how we do education here in the United States. Our Constitution is actually silent on education. So when we talk about public education funding, we need to look at the Constitution of the state of California, which has very lofty language about how knowledge and intelligence are essential, but speaks very little about funding our schools adequately. So in comes the California Department of Education. It is our state oversight agency, and it apportions money to local education agencies, including San Francisco Unified School District. So SFUSD gets its federal and state money from the CDE. That is the bureaucratic framework that we're talking about. So the California State Legislature had its first position on school funding in 1860. And this is a screen grab of the School Law of 1860. I'm not going to read it, but it basically says that certain students, namely students of color, will not be admitted to public schools. And if the school district admits students of color to public schools, the state will hold back the California State School Fund money to that school district. So again, we have, starting in 1860, a funding and budgetary system that withholds state support for students of color. So as a result, there has been a century of illegal attempts by parents and advocates to try and address de jure segregation and its associated differential funding. So it started here in San Francisco with the 1872 Ward v. Flood case, and that involved African-American parents. The 1885 Tate v. Hurley case, which involved Asian American parents. 1946, Latinx parents suing the state of California. All of which is to say that there has been many legal battles waged over a long period to try and address unequal funding. And while all of these efforts were underway, you can imagine the delta growing because investments compound over time between the resources that had been given to schools primarily attended by white students versus schools attended by other students. So the Brown v. Board of Education, very famous US Supreme Court case, made segregated schools unconstitutional. And we have been working ever since to try and make that a reality. So I'm going to talk briefly about the 1965 Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESEA, which is the first major federal legislation to invest in public schools at the federal level. So when we think about our budget, we can think about it looking like a three-legged stool. This is a very common metaphor for when we think about funding. So the federal money coming in through ESEA and its successor legislation, you may be familiar with No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, recently with COVID relief money coming from the feds to school districts, that supplements state money. So the state portion for many school districts is the most significant source of its funding. Local revenues are comprised of local property taxes. We're going to talk about the importance of local property taxes right now. So for many decades, following the Brown v. Board decision, funding for our public schools was based on local revenues. So more affluent communities with higher property values had more money to fund its schools. So there were two major cases in the 1970s. You may have heard about the Serrano decision, where the California Supreme Court stated that because education is a fundamental right, a property tax-based school funding system was unconstitutional because it resulted in huge variation in the amount of dollars that went to different school districts. And it ordered the state legislature to figure out how to equalize funding across the state. So after Serrano could be meaningfully implemented, California voters in 1978 passed Proposition 13, which capped how much property tax money could be used in the public school system in order to equalize funding, but also for schools in general. So many of you probably are familiar with the effect of Prop 13 on California per pupil spending. So the first third of this chart shows that for most of the 1970s, we had California exceeding sort of this threshold line, which represents what the other states in the United States were spending on education. But you can see that after that, we dropped significantly under the line. And so we have been underfunding public schools in California relative to other states since Prop 13. So what ends up happening is that not only has the amount per pupil declined consistently since Prop 13, the property tax component of funding has also declined. And now we are increasingly reliant on more volatile economy-dependent sources of tax, including personal income tax and sales tax. So when we are booming in California, we have more money, but when we hit economic hard times, we have less money for our schools. In an effort to address the volatility, the legislature passed a couple of measures trying to ensure that our schools didn't go on this roller coaster ride. It developed a formula to calculate funds. But what was meant as a floor for minimum school funding during lean years has become a ceiling even in the boom times. So even as recently in 2004, we had a class action lawsuit filed here in California, and it spoke to the fact that even as recently as 2004, we have grossly underinvested in our schools with building repair and maintenance and books and libraries not being attended to at all as recently as 2004. So I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of charts. This one is sort of encapsulates the fact that here, California, where our dashed line, we fall far below some of our peer states and per pupil funding. And very quickly, without trying to get too jargony, I wanted to talk about how we fund our schools today. So in 2013, the state legislature passed what's called the local control funding formula. And this would address the complexity of these various calculations and components of our public school budget. And it used a principle, a budgeting principle to ensure equity in how we fund our schools. So we have a base grant, which ensures that every student in California receives the same amount of money from the state. Supplemental grants are given to students who have certain characteristics that make them more expensive to educate and therefore more resources flow to them. These include low-income students, English learners, and students in foster care, and concentration grants where school districts that have a higher percentage of students who qualify also receive additional funding. And San Francisco Unified School District benefits from LCFF because we have students who are higher need, and as a result, we get concentration and supplemental grant funding through LCFF. So we have property taxes. Again, we're looking at our local amount of support, and then state taxes that that come in and fill our budgetary pot, as it were. I just wanted to highlight, even though we have LCFF, there are still some very affluent communities in California where they do not receive any state money because they continue through their local property taxes to be able to pay for their public schools. And these are called basic aid districts. And we're just wanted to make sure that people understand that there are these little pockets, but we are not here in San Francisco a basic aid district. So quickly, we have other sources of funding for schools. Philanthropies in the last few decades have become very active in trying to support public schools. We also have parents who fundraise through organizations like PTAs, like Carol mentioned. She was the head of the California State PTA, and 501c3 parent organizations that are not affiliated with PTAs, but are their own entity of parents. Corporate donations. Here in San Francisco, we benefit from corporate nonprofit arms like Salesforce. And here in San Francisco Unified, we also have a school district supported foundation called Spark SF Public Schools. And of course, we have the San Francisco Ed Fund. So briefly, a diagram just showing that we have public money that comes in sort of from the top of the slide. We have private money coming in from the bottom of the slide. It gets apportioned out by the district to our various school sites. So meat and potatoes time. So given all of this, why does SFUSD have a structural deficit? It's expensive here in San Francisco, as we all know. So it's a high cost of living, and we have a high poverty rate. This is not news to anyone. We have declining enrollment. So I think the latest statistics I know, and I will check, is that we are 4% fewer students this school year as compared to last year. And that has a bearing on the LCFF calculations. And the LCFF formula in terms of resources from the state doesn't keep up with our local personnel costs. And it's not just SFUSD, districts everywhere are spending more on retiree health and pension benefits. And I'm sure we'll talk about that. Again, this graph just talks about the components of expenditure line items. You'll see that state teacher retirement system expenses have gone higher up since the 2010s, and other post-employment benefits are also quite high. Declining enrollment is also not unique to San Francisco. It's happening throughout the state, primarily in the more expensive coastal areas. So briefly, I'm sure we'll talk about this as well. So the state superintendent of public instruction has assigned a fiscal expert to partner with SFUSD and figure out ways of addressing its deficit. And there is a state FICMAT team completing a fiscal health risk analysis. And on the positive side, in November, the Proposition G, which had been contested in court, was upheld, and the school district is now able to access over $100 million in additional revenue. So I'm going to end here. So this is a snapshot from the SFUSD budget office. So we are talking about several line items. When we talk about site-based budgets, these are site budgets at the schools themselves. Central budgets are services provided by the district central office to all schools. Total expenditures, this line item, you can see that there is an ongoing $90 million deficit. We have some new sources anticipated. And even though we have a balanced, a quote unquote balanced budget this year, we do have a significant ongoing budget deficit. This slide basically just incorporates our Prop G revenues for sort of the out years. So it helps a little, but it doesn't address the major reality that we have a deficit that we need to look at and think about how to fund. Just some citations and resources. Let me stop here. Sorry, I went a little bit over. I apologize.
All right, thank you, Debbie. I think it's so interesting to see like how the legacy of the history has then led to us needing to do all these adjustments. And actually, I do want to ask Irina to jump in here. Of, you know, as I'm thinking about what Debbie just shared, it seems like certain policies, like Prop 13, created then a need to try to buffer in so many different ways, whether through, you know, parcel tax or LCFF or other things that is happening. But I feel like there's continuous scarcity of resources. Can you talk a bit more about like why certain policies have had such a disproportional impact on education systems in California?
Well, Proposition 13 has the major impact, as Debbie indicated. Before Prop 13, local districts set their own ceiling for the tax, right? School boards were instrumental in doing so. And then that's the Serrano's case that Debbie was discussing, which was supposed to bring some equity to California schools. Unfortunately, with Proposition 13, it sets the property tax at 1%, right? And so what I think hasn't been mentioned is how much corporations pay. So corporations pay as much as the homeowners pay. However, homeowners move and they buy property and sell property a lot more consistently than corporations. So when you think about Prop 13 being in effect for the last 43 years, most corporations in California are still paying their tax at the set rate of 1978, so which was 43 years ago, because corporations don't change hands as often. And I think and it's political, and it was political then, and it is political now, because it's Prop 13 been around for 43 years. And I think, as we discussed earlier, I believe that it will take another decade or so to try to change that. So as a result of Proposition 13, before corporations pay 2/3 of local taxes, now they only pay 1/3. And that change how California collects money and how it distributes money. So that's why our state tax is so high right now, or we feel that it's high, and that's why the sales tax is high, because that's how the state is trying to make up for the deficit that they used to receive prior to 78 from the local property taxes. So that's a problem. And of course, the school sends the majority of funding. So roughly speaking, 75 to 80% of funding comes from the state. Our schools and our districts are affected by it, right? So because the system is impoverished. And this is something that I talk a lot in my own discussions, as well as in my publications, is that we all have to understand that the system operates from an impoverished perspective, right? So all systems, even the most wealthy system of education in California, are still impoverished. And so that deficit perspective, or impoverished perspective rather, drives the way we make decisions, right? So decisions are more reactive, they're more based on the situation, they're more situational versus proactive, right? And versus thinking about how to address equity concerns. So with LCFF that Debbie mentioned, which is the current formula, right? The funding operations for the school districts. What needs to be remembered is that it was based on the consolidation and redistribution model. It's not more funds, it's just consolidation and redistribution model for funds that have already been in existence, right? So flexibility adds very little to solving the issue that our educational system is impoverished. And so, yeah, and it creates this very impossible conundrum, right? And very complicated conundrum to solve that will take everybody, legislators, local communities, as well as everybody on the ground who is involved in the educational system to try to resolve.
Yeah, it's just so complicated and tricky, as you're mentioning. When looking at one of the graphs Debbie had posted up with just, California's per pupil funding is like 10,000, 11,000 less sometimes, versus New York is at like 18 and Boston's at like 25,000 a student. And you just think about private school costs are like $25,000, $30,000 a student. Just that comparison of, to your point, like you can redistribute the funding, but it's not like there's more funding going around for kids is really challenging.
Absolutely. And just to give you a real example, so this is something that I didn't mention in my introduction. I was also a school board member, and half of those years on the school board I spent as a president. So and I was a school board member in Dixon, California. So, and one of the issue, just to give you an idea how real the property tax issue is between the homeowners and corporations. We were getting ready at that time. So this was back in 2000, I believe 11 or 12, we were getting ready to sell portion of our land, right? To liquidate some funds for capital projects that we had plans for. And in order to do that, we had to do a survey. And so with that survey, in the area of the district, so they plan out, right, who generates which amount in property taxes. And there was a small portion, considerable, but a small portion on the map was Pfizer. So Pfizer is in Vacaville, and so they were in a portion of it, of of the map. They occupied the portion of the map in our district, essentially. And I looked at that map. I remember running that meeting, and we were having this discussion, how to read this map, how to think about taxes, what we're going to do with the land, what we're going to do with consolidation, liquidation rather of that land, and so on and so forth. And I looked at that map and I said, wait a minute, the tax for Pfizer are equivalent to what I pay in tax from my house in Dixon, which was $1,870 or so, at that time. And I said, this must be a mistake. We're missing a zero here. And they're like, no, it is not a mistake. It was set at 1978, 1% margin back in the day. And that really, studying it and theoretically thinking about how taxes operate in California is one thing, but actually having that reality check, right, with respect to my own home ownership, right, with respect to the district for which I was, which I was representing and I was responsible for, it was surreal to see that, this sizable chunk of property that Pfizer was on is paying the same amount that I am for my, tiny hut down the road. So anyway,
Wow,
so just a real perspective on how, how broken a tax system is.
Right, when you're grandfathered in versus it being adapted to current times is really tricky. And Carol, I want to invite you in to share. I know, as Irina was saying, we're reallocating funding, but it's the same pot of money and there's not much increases. But I know you've been part of some efforts to try to increase that pot of money. Can you talk a bit more about what we've done locally or in California to try to increase the total amount of money going to kids?
Well, sure. I can talk about what we've done in California. And also, I think it's quite interesting as to what we've done here in San Francisco. Over the last few years to try to address the low level of funding, the state has passed a couple of propositions, Proposition 30 and Proposition 55, which increase funding for education by taxing wealthier people. And as Irina was talking about, 2 years ago, we had an initiative called Prop 15, which would have changed how we tax corporations. And unfortunately, depending on your political point of view, but from my mouth, it's unfortunately, that failed. And that would have driven millions of new dollars into education. And so that was a defeat, but I think people are gonna, look and say, oh, let's do it again, or, find another way of doing it. There are also proposals, and I think one of them is a very interesting proposal, and it goes along with the earlier presentation, and it has to do with where we get the money to pay for schools. Over the years, it used to be, I'll go like this, it used to be like if you had a chart and this was the amount of money in the chart that was for sales tax. That was a big driver of funding for schools. And at the same time, the amount of personal taxes were about this big. And so what's happened? If you look at that chart again, the amount for personal income taxes is like this, and the amount for sales tax is like this. When you look at what percentage of the money goes to pay for our general fund budget. And there have been proposals, which I personally think are a good idea, is not to increase the rate of the sales tax, but to make the sales tax reflect our economy, because the sales tax was based on things you sell. You go into the store and you buy something and you pay a sales tax on it, but it's not paid on services and professional services. So if we expanded that to go into areas that are high generators of income in this economy, but don't generate sales tax, like accounting fees, lawyers' fees, other fee-based services, that is a way of expanding the pie without raising taxes on everyone, without raising personal income taxes. So I think that's something to think about. Now, I like to talk about San Francisco because San Francisco, although we're facing this terrible deficit and we have high costs, actually invests more in schools and our children than practically any other place. And a big part of that is local activism, advocacy. And I am a big supporter of parents and communities looking at problems and saying, we have to solve it. And we have to solve it because we want to have a great place for our children to grow up. And there are a couple of them that I actually was involved in. One was, we never had libraries that were robust. When I first moved here, and that's a little while ago, we had a library system that was, not really good. And now we have one of the top library systems in the nation. And one of the reasons is voters said, we think libraries are important. We think kids should be able to go to the libraries. We think our branch libraries are important. There should be access between schools and libraries. And that was a grassroots campaign that set aside a certain portion of the city budget to pay for libraries. And so we have a steady stream, stable stream of money for libraries, which is terrific. And it has really helped kids in schools with all the programs that they provide. The second thing that we did, and this is one of my favorites, because when my kids were in school, I was appalled because the parents had to pay for the music teacher. And I said, what's up here? The parents at my school, we can reach into our pockets and we can pay for a music teacher. But parents at other schools can't do that. And it's really totally unfair. And so I got really angry and started an advocacy campaign to bring the arts into our schools. And it was picked up by the Board of Supervisors, who appointed a special task force. And we did a survey of all the schools and what they had and what they didn't have and what they needed and what it would cost to put them where they needed to be. After that, Supervisor Tom Amiano said, oh yeah, we do need more stable funding for our schools. And this idea about arts is really important. And I remember this, his staffer called me and to talk to me about it because I was like all over the place saying we need arts in our schools. And he said, I have this proposal and we're going to put this huge chunk of money for the arts. And of course I smiled. And then I looked at the proposal and I said, there are a lot of other needs besides the arts. And so today, and I said, we don't have librarians, but we don't have enough money for sports. And we don't have money for a lot of other things like nurses and counselors in our schools. And so what they did with that proposal, and I was tickled, was the arts proposal, which we now have that gives our schools guaranteed money for arts and music and librarians and sports. That was broken down from only arts to be all of those. And so we now have all of that funding generated. And that again is a set aside in the city budget. Mm-hmm. And so that's the big difference between San Francisco and a lot of other municipalities. The city has actually stepped up, the people have stepped up and said, if we don't have something in this pot of money, we've got another pot of money that we think we should invest in. So I think that was really a smart thing to do. Yeah, and really the other thing that we've done, am I talking too long?
Oh, yeah, I was going to comment of just, I think that's really interesting to hear. I think, Carol, what you're alluding to is just, while it's hard for us to increase the main pot of money going to schools, we can figure out when and where there's additional spaces for us to support. And I actually do want to invite Debbie back into the conversation here of, kind of as a parent with kids currently in the school system, how has both kind of the budget deficit from the way funding does happen in our state impacted our schools and students and teachers, and also where are we have different other opportunities to supplement some of that from external pots of money to what Carol's been sharing.
Right. My sort of view of how we fund our schools is very expansive. And that is that we not only fund our schools, but we fund everything that affects children. Because if children are hungry, if children are unhoused, if children are ill, if parents don't have time to spend with their children, our children suffer, and that affects our whole education system. So I have this broad view. But going back a little bit to that, is two other things that we did in San Francisco that were alluded to. And I think they're really smart. We're a early childhood proposition that is paid for out of a tax on commercial property that pays for early childhood and childcare. And the other one was the proposition to pay for teachers' salaries and professional education. And those two things were held up in court, and that's one of the things that's behind part of the problem that San Francisco has with its deficit, because both of those passed by less than a 2/3 vote. And for years and years, people said, if you want to pass something locally, it has to be passed by a 2/3 vote. But there was a court case that said there's a distinction. If you pass something that's put on the ballot by an elected official, like the Board of Supervisors puts something on the ballot, that requires a 2/3 vote. But if you go out to the public and gather signatures and put it on the ballot, that just requires a majority vote. Well, all the folks who didn't want to increase taxes for almost any reason sued and sued and sued and sued. And so for several years, all of that money was in limbo, and it put the district in between a rock and a hard place, because they had promised teachers increased salaries, and our teachers needed increased salaries. As we said before, this is a very expensive place to live. We're not going to have great teachers unless we pay them enough. And so the school district had to figure out, well, what are we going to do during this time when we're in litigation? And what happened was they took money out of their reserve funds and paid for it. And the city, thankfully, and I think in a very smart move, said, we're going to help you and help cover that, two and a half year period when we didn't know whether we were going to get the money at all. And we had committed to all of these salary increases.
I see.
So
Yeah.
I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, thank you, Carol. Let me pause you there. I think there's like lots of good examples of how we come up with different ways of supporting. Debbie, back to you. I think the question around what is all of this, both like the lack of funding from major places, but then also trying to supplement from different places. What does it actually look like then played out in a school and the student experience in San Francisco?
Yeah, I think, having lived through a decade ago during the Great Recession when my daughter was in elementary school and we went through the first major round of budget cuts that I experienced through that, what we saw at my daughter's elementary school was significant fundraising by parents to preserve all of the services and programs that had existed pre-recession, and huge impacts at school sites that did not benefit from private fundraising. So I think it's really important to make sure that that doesn't happen this time. And I think folks are much more aware of that phenomenon occurring. And as Carol mentioned, I think here in San Francisco, we're thinking more holistically about how do we meet students' basic needs, and having this, the Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which is a city and county department, step in and provide basic needs. How do we partner with nonprofit organizations and funders to try and bring in resources to students in the district before school and after school to try and dampen some of the negative impacts of a structural budget deficit. But I think, as Irina mentioned, there is this feeling of scarcity, but scarcity only in the public funds. We are an incredibly resource-rich, capital-rich community, and we have an urgent need to tap into our generous and thoughtful members of the community right now because it's so urgently needed.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. And actually, I think we have a few minutes left. Actually, want to do a final round of quick whip around for the panelists on this final question of, as Debbie was saying, like there's a large gap in the way policy has determined our funding, and there's a lot of opportunities here in San Francisco. For our audience here, and Irina, I'll pass it to you first. Like where do we go from here? How can people both help individually or at smaller and large ways as we think about improving public school finances?
Well, Stacey, as I'm listening about how funds are raised for individual schools, right, and what Carol is saying, I think what it reminds me, and we need to be careful of this, right, is that we're not going to go back to pre-Serrano, where the district school boards set the property tax, right, for each community, because when we think about funding schools through various initiatives, although in the meantime, that is a great idea. Partial tax is a great idea. Being able to have it driven by the community and only needing the majority to pass it, that is excellent, right? Although it was stuck in court, as Karen alluded to, and actually educated me prior to that, but nevertheless, the case law prevailed, right? And so in the meantime, it's good. It should serve as a bridge. Same thing what Debbie is talking about, but we really need to be careful not to go to pre-Serrano times, because when you think about it, right, when you raise tax through when you raise funds through parcel taxes, right, or local fundraising and such, so that creates disparity within the community, obviously, right, and between districts as well. And we need to be very mindful of this, so moving forward, what needs to change is the system, right? We need to look at bigger picture in terms of how taxation works, right? We need to rely more on cost out studies. Cost out studies have to do with looking at how much education actually costs, especially for the students who are habitually marginalized and underrepresented, and have a real number in mind. In addition to that, and this is what I argue in my own work in the area of finance, is we also need to look how monies are spent. Okay, so how are these funds channeled? Are they channeled on direct services or towards direct services to the students, or are they misused, right? So so these are the things to consider, or the questions, the questions to ask. I also ask before we move forward, right, in a more kind of healthy direction, I guess, for the lack of a better word. I also completely and 100 and 200% agree with what Carol said. We need to think about schools as these comprehensive centers for students, right? That are responsible for the childcare, that are responsible for the student well-being, that are also responsible for the student education, right? And to address their needs while parents are at work or they're taking care of business elsewhere. So, and with that in mind, we have to think of schools as more of educational, right, and community centers, and not only as content delivery mechanisms, right? So because schools are responsible to take care of our students, right? When we're doing other things, they're responsible for education. And if they have a certain needs, those needs need to be met in a more comprehensive way, because they spend children spend huge amount of time in school when you think about their life trajectories, right? And their week worth of activities. So yes, I think perceptions is what we address first, right? And then we need to address what we value and our values, and re-examine a vision and our values. And if education is something that we value, if we value good, comprehensive care, and I'm going to step away from education, but care for students, right? Then we need to rethink essentially the system, right, and how the system operates, and that would be a good first start.
Yeah, thank you. Carol, do you have a 1 minute? What would you want to say?
I do have a 1 minute, and there are lots of, technical things about raising money, but I just want to talk about one thing. And it's not only how much money we have, but how we spend it. Are we investing it in a smart way? And to me, the crisis is facing not only San Francisco, but throughout the state, is our kids are not learning to read. That is the most basic thing that we should be teaching our children and children for years and years and years, because of the way we're teaching reading are suffering. It's not great when, more than half the kids aren't proficient in first grade and second grade and third grade. And kids who are poor or low income, the numbers are even worse. And so the one thing that I would do that would give us the most bang for the buck is make sure that every school district invests in the science of reading, that curriculum reflects the science of reading, that every single teacher who is in touch with an elementary school child knows how to do the science of reading. The way we've been teaching it, balanced literacy, has not worked. It hasn't worked here. It hasn't worked in Los Angeles. It hadn't worked in San Diego. It hasn't worked anywhere in terms of how do we teach kids really how to read those letters that are printed on the page. And the other thing that we need to do is make sure that we assess kids regularly, kindergarten through third grade, to see if they are struggling with any disability or something that's interfering with their ability to read, and interfere and provide resources immediately so that that child doesn't fall behind. Because we know that old saying, K to 3, you learn to read. After that, you read to learn. And if we don't learn to read, it shows up in all the later grades. They do poorly in science, in math, in everything else, because we have not met that basic responsibility.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Carol. Debbie, final words?
Watch what happens with the district, stay informed and engaged with the ongoing budget discussions, read Carol's blogs. There are a lot that we can do as parents and voters here in San Francisco. So many great organizations get involved with the Ed Fund. There are so many ways to get involved and informed. And, as Irina mentioned, our budget is an expression of our values. If we profess to care about students and families here in our city, then we can show that commitment by becoming more active and engaged and more willing to contribute financially and with our time.
Yeah, thank you, Debbie. And thank you so much, Carol and Irina. This has been a really robust conversation, and thank you all for sharing your knowledge and expertise with this group. And for our guests here, we are going to continue having additional conversations like today's on different topics. There's going to actually be one on literacy coming up, so Carol will keep you posted on that one. And then also around the shifts in enrollment, and how we're thinking differently about increasing equity across zones of the city. And finally, the board is, the finance team at the district is reporting to the board the updates about their budget. So to what Debbie just said, continue learning and engaging. The board meeting next Wednesday will have a lot to cover around the financial situation and the budget revise. So thank you all again for being here. Keep learning, keep following us. We'll keep talking. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.